Please proceed.
Thank you, Governor Hoseman, Speaker Gunn, and members of the committee. We really appreciate the chance to come and talk with you this morning. Thank you for having us. Before we go any further, let me say just quickly, as usual, we have some PERS staff team members here, but also I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have a few board members here that wanted to attend just to express their interest and support in the audience. We have Ms. Kim Hanna, who is the chair of the board this particular year, and she is one of the representatives that's elected to the PERS board by the municipalities. And we also have Mr. Bill Benson, who is the past chair of the board, who is elected to PERS by the counties. And we also have George Dale, who is one of the retiree representatives, again, just to express their interest and support. And you may know most of them. Mr. Benson is a elected local official in Lee County. Ms. Hanna is the CFO of Tupelo, and then Commissioner Dale was a longtime insurance commissioner. So together, we, with the rest of the board and staff, look forward to working with you on PERS. And if agreeable, what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about where we are, where we've been, and where we could be going. And as I do that, I think that will cover a lot of the hot topics, the areas of interest, the current affairs, and answer a lot of questions, and then also set the stage for questions that I'm sure you may have. As far as where we are, I know this group is very familiar with PERS and what it is and the importance of PERS, so I'll be very brief in that area. But I will just take a moment, a minute or so, just to remind us how important I think PERS is, not only to our membership, but also to the state of Mississippi. Important in terms of people and dollars. And I know you're familiar with the people and the large segment of the population with PERS that you represent, but also important in terms of dollars and economics. In addition to our $30 billion pension fund, we pay out over $3 billion annually now each year in benefit payments. Over 90% of that stays in the state of Mississippi, ripples throughout the economy, generates a lot of economic activity, and creates a lot of jobs, and generates hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue. And just think about that $3 billion in the context of, say, the state general fund, just for context of the size of the number. I know it's a different pot of money, but think about that. And in terms of the various industries in Mississippi or the economic development projects in Mississippi, all of those things are very important. But we have in PERS essentially a $3 billion recession-proof income stream going throughout the economy. So I won't spend any more time on the background of PERS unless you want me to, but I think it's important to know that. And what's even more important is we got to remember the people behind the numbers. And so, again, we can come back to that more, but to provide some additional information as to where we are, have some good information, good news to report on investments as far as last fiscal year. Last fiscal year, we finished the year with a 7.76 gross investment return that compared to our peers meaning other public pension funds nationally. To our peer group of pension funds over $10 billion, that exceeds the median. The median for that group was around 7.5%. Again, we were almost at 7.8. Also, if you compare us to pension funds over $25 billion, the median for that group was around 7%. Again, we were at 7.8. So we did compare well compared to peers. We did lag behind our benchmark a little bit. By benchmark, I mean a comparison to the markets based on our investment mix. So we lagged behind that a little bit this year. That was due primarily to our exposure in private equity and real estate, but both of those asset classes have been very good for us long term, and they were the reason that we exceeded the benchmark last year. But it also illustrates why we should focus on the longer term returns, and to share some of that, as of June 30, the 5-year, the 10-year, and the 15-year as of June 30, we compared well to peers by exceeding the median and also exceeded our benchmark. And again, by benchmark, I'm just talking about a comparison to the markets based on our investment mix or asset allocation. And in fact, on the 15-year return, we ranked in the 8th percentile, which would mean we outperformed 92% of public pensions in that peer group. That said, even though we're pleased with that for the year that it was, because we finished on a high note and had a positive June, it won't always be that good. We're certainly not immune to global events or the national economy and so forth, but it is some good news to report. The average PERS benefit is now around $26,000. That includes the cost of living adjustment. The average PERS member salary is around $45,000. And our funded ratio, referring to the actuarial funded ratio, right now is around 61%. And the funded ratio, that's a key metric in the pension industry. It's not the only one, but it's a key one that's reported on that we monitor. And it's basically comparing the actuarial assets to the actuarial liabilities. In other words, the difference between what you need and what you have. And ours right now is 61%. It's hovered at about that same level for several years. As I transition now to where we've been, I want to focus more on the other 39%. The other 39% represents the unfunded. The full name is the UAAL, or the unfunded actuarially accrued liability, but unfunded. And for us, that's a little over $20 billion. And that's accumulated over decades. It's not uncommon for a pension fund to have an unfunded liability, especially one that is mature or maturing like PERS, but it is something to monitor and manage with and through. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how we got to the $20 billion. One, we are an accumulation of everything that's happened since we were created roughly 70 years ago. Every law change, every benefit increase, every assumption change, every major board decision, every economic expansion, every recession. It's an accumulation of that. But I'm going to focus on the last quarter century. And so if we go back to 1998, and I choose 98 mainly because that is when our funded ratio was at its highest or one of its highest levels. Now, when I say quarter century seems like a long time ago. And that seems like a long time ago. But if you think back to what you were doing in 1998, I'm sure many of you can remember what you were doing in 98. In my case, I was graduating college, or at least undergrad. I know it's football season. We're in SEC country. I think Jackie Sherrill was still at Mississippi State, and Eli Manning was about to get to Ole Miss. When you think of it like that, to me, that seems like that time goes by really, really quickly. And I think the next 25 years will go by quickly, and what we can do together will have an impact on the next generation and the next term and the next set of leaders. But over that last 25 years, I want to recap for you on one hand what I think the main reasons are that help lead to the 20 billion. It won't be an all-inclusive list, but it will give a real good feel, in my opinion, a real good highlight or summary of the themes that help lead to the 20 billion. In no particular order, starting at about that time frame, there were some additional benefits funded into law in the late 90s and the early 2000s without additional funding at the time. Now, you can make the case that the cost has been baked into the rate since that time, and that's true, and that's part of the reason that they've gone up and may continue to go up, but no additional funding at the time. And then in the two subsequent decades after that, you had a little bit of what I'll call a perfect administrative storm, creating some challenges, because after the benefits were increased, we had, for the next 10 or 20 years, we've had a declining active to retiree ratio. And by that, I mean fewer actives coming in and paying into the system, and more retirees coming on and retiring to draw off of the system, and retirees living longer. And that's not a bad thing, but it has a cost. We also, in those 2 decades that followed, we had several economic downturns, including the Great Recession, the once-in-a-generation recession, hopefully, the global financial crisis. You had the downturn in the early 2000s that a lot of people refer to as the dot-com bubble. You had the Great Recession around 08 and 09, and we had a downturn prior to the pandemic. And there may be some others in there that I missed, but you had several downturns, including the Great Recession. And then the last area I'll highlight is just a more conservative approach toward public pensions and the public pension community. And by public pension community, I mean the actuarial community, the investment community, the audit community, the think tanks, the political organizations, the policy organizations, bond rating agencies, virtually all of the above. And that more conservative approach is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing for a conservative state like Mississippi. It's not necessarily a bad thing for PERS, but it does have a cost. I'll just mention 2 areas. One is the amortization method, meaning the way that you finance that unfunded. Previously, their approach was an open method, which essentially meant that you refinanced the liability each year. Now, at least for one key metric in our funding policy, we've taken a closed approach, which means you have the goal to eventually pay it off. And the other one is the assumed rate of return. The assumed rate of return, there's been a lot of downward pressure on that. That is arguably one of the most important assumptions that a pension fund has, because it is not only the rate at which your investments are assumed to grow, but it also is used as the discount rate, in fact, creating and determining the liability. So it's very important. I know we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So to recap, on one hand, again, it may not cover every reason, but it covers the main ones, which would be the additional benefits placed into law without funding at the time, declining active to retiree ratio, several economic downturns, including the Great Recession, and then a more conservative approach to public pensions. And that has all led to the 20 billion. And I know that that is of interest and concern and maybe sometimes frustrating, but it's just taken decades to build up and it won't go away anytime soon. We have to work together to come up with solutions and ideas to manage with and through that. On that note, we have been working diligently to come up with some recommendations and other things for PERS. Um, Really and truly, we've been looking at different scenarios and considering options and possible changes since shortly after I joined PERS in 2018. But we've certainly been doing that the last 2 or 3 years. But the more recent effort and more renewed focus, I guess you could say, started last December when the employer contribution rate was raised. Also, in that meeting, the board passed a motion directing staff to develop a new Tier 5 and other options for consideration. And of course, that was followed by the interest and the request from the legislature during session. So we've been working on that since that time in February, and we have some areas that I think that we've started to move forward on, and the board has taken some recent actions on it, and also it's still a work in progress with more to discuss in October, but certainly to have a plan and some ideas or responses and information to you prior to session. And on those, just to recap those, one was voting to phase in the employer contribution rate increase. The board voted to phase in that increase at 2% each year, starting next July, 2% each year until it reaches the amount recommended by the actuary and approved by the board. And that would mean that next year the rate would only increase from 17.4 to 19.4%. Another action was to adopt the assumptions recommended by the actuary after our last experience study. We do that every 2 years on a rolling 4-year basis, and those were adopted, and that included lowering the assumption, the assumed rate of return from 7.55 down to 7%, based on the recommendation of the actuary. Me and others, the board voted to adopt that, and it's important to have good assumptions, and because if you don't, then you're inadvertently understating the liabilities and the funding to the plan. So that is one. We also voted, I believe, in my opinion, I think for all intents and purposes, the board has determined their position on, or their direction on what we'll recommend for a new Tier 5. And by Tier 5, I'm talking about a new benefit structure for future employees. You may remember that we have different tiers in PERS depending upon when you were hired. And so when I say Tier 5, I'm talking about that possible different benefit for future employees. And I think for all intents and purposes, we've decided that direction, and it'll be recommended as a reduced defined benefit, very similar to current PERS, current to Tier 4, except it would have 4-year vesting and no guaranteed COLA. Instead of a guaranteed COLA, it'd be the possibility of a COLA tied to CPI, capped at 3%, and then also based on funding availability at the time. And staff, we're working on the criteria to talk with the board and show with the board in October of possibly what that ad hoc COLA could look like. So that's what I mean by work in progress. But I think for all intents and purposes, that's what our recommendation or legislative package and request would include. The board also voted to seek additional funding from the legislature. The details of that are yet to be determined, but whether that be supplemental funding or funding to offset the increase or funding to offset the increase at the local level, or new revenue or dedicated revenue, or perhaps a cash infusion to help like some other states have done, or direct appropriations. Again, details to be determined on that, but that's what one of the actions we also voted on, and particularly around maybe the cost of the benefits from the late 90s and the early 2000s. And then the last two items, one deals with the ORP, the other one with the COLA. The ORP, just to remind you, is the optional retirement plan. It's an optional plan for certain faculty and administrator positions within the institutions of higher learning. It's a defined contribution plan. When it was created years ago, the employer match for the participant into their DC account was tied to the PERS employer contribution rate. And of course, the PERS rate has been increasing due to the unfunded. And on that, I may have forgot to mention one key thing about the reason I highlighted that unfunded. We got to remember about the reason I mentioned the 20 billion is that the great majority of the employer contribution rate goes for the unfunded. And that's what was driving the recent rate increase, and that's what may drive future increases. Also on the Tier 5, I need to mention, even though I think a Tier 5 would be important, I think a Tier 5 has many advantages, but it's important to note and emphasize that a Tier 5 is not a cure-all, and it's not a quick fix. It doesn't do anything to address the 20 billion in the short term, and it doesn't eliminate the need to raise the rate. So I think it has many advantages, and I hope we pursue one, but it's important that I mention that. ORP, though, the participants match was tied to the PERS contribution rate. So we're going to propose to modify the law where those participants will still receive an appropriate match, but the additional money will come to PERS for the unfunded as we think it should, and it's probably designed. And then the last one is a recommendation to move the COLA default to monthly as opposed to lump sum. Just to remind you, the additional benefit, commonly referred to as the cost of living adjustment, is in statute, and the default position is that it will be a lump sum in December unless the member or retiree opts to have it monthly, and we're going to propose to change that default to monthly to move in that direction, largely for planning reasons. But do want to emphasize that particular change, if approved, would not reduce the benefit, would not cut a benefit. It's just moving the default to monthly, and the member would still have the option to choose the lump sum if they want it. And so with that, I really appreciate the time. As I start to close, let me just say, PERS is a great system. Again, not only important to our membership, but also the state. But when it comes to PERS, at this point, I believe you could sum it up by saying we either fund it, change it, or eventually you begin to risk it. And what I mean by that is to keep it solid long term, something is either going to have to cost more or something's going to have to change, or both. Either raise the rate or cut the benefit, basically. And to be clear, I don't think we have an emergency now. I don't think we need drastic measures in the morning. We have over $30 billion to pay benefits. But when it comes to having discussions like this or talking about new tiers, rates, and assumptions, I just think it's important that we have a frank conversation, a realistic conversation. And from our standpoint, we certainly want to work together with the legislature. I hope we do, us as fiduciaries, you all as policymakers, as well as the other stakeholders at the local level, retirees and otherwise. And we support the continuation and sustainability of PERS. And, PERS is stable. We just have to work together to keep it that way. And with that, again, I really appreciate the time and y'all inviting us here, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Questions from the panel? Questions from the panel? Yes, sir.
Just a few, Ray, if you don't mind. You mentioned the 1 year return. I think you said around 7.5%. Is that right?
7.76.
Okay. I'm curious as to our 3 year, 5 year, 10 year. I think we even have a 15.
Sure.
So what's our track record?
So 3 year as of June 30 is a little over 9%. The 10 year, I believe, is just below 8.5%. The 30 year is about 7.8%. And that 15 year, when we were comparing to the other peer group, I believe was around 7.5 as well.
What about 3 years?
3 years about 9.36, I think, a little over 9%.
Curious also as to where the employer contribution rates, we're what, 17.5 now?
17.4.
Y'all had proposed to go to 2 percentage points.
That's correct, with the phase in.
Yeah. I have heard, everybody has heard, possibly up to 27%, 10 percentage points. Where does that stack compare to other state pension funds?
Sure. I think it would be above the average and above the median to that last part of the question.
17 or 27?
Definitely the 27. And to speak a little, if I can, a little more fully on that. So that is correct. And how we get there is the 22.4% was recommended before, and we're phasing that in. Where the 27% comes in is 22% now as far as the rate by the actuary. When you change the assumed rate of return, it goes to around 25 or 26%. And then assuming that what we would recommend and need a phase in is where the 27.4% comes into place. So the phase in approach has been voted on where it'd be 2% per year, but the 27 comes in as the potential based on current actuarial projections and the current information with the assumed rate of return going to 7%. That is the current projection for that possible ultimate top end rate right now. Now it could change. We could have positive experience. We could have negative experience, but that's where that comes from with the change in the assumption. Again, back to other states, I think it varies. Each state varies. It's really unique and somewhat challenging to compare PERS to other states in some ways because each state's different and they have different systems. Some states may have a teacher system and a law enforcement system and a regular employee system. Some states are like PERS, we have it all together. So that makes it a little bit more challenging sometimes to compare for us. Because like, for example, a teacher system may have slightly richer benefits than an employee system, so the rate may be higher. A law enforcement type first responder system would have higher rates because of the benefit structure. But with that said, we are above the median or average, probably a little bit now, but certainly with the increases based on the information I've seen last. Now that'll be lagging a little bit because it takes time for the national organizations to report it, but I would say above the median.
So we're already on the high end at 17.
A little bit, yes. Yeah. Not as much as with the increase. Of course, others are going up too, so we'll have to wait and see the latest information as this year's reported, because assumptions in other states have been going down as well. Contribution rates have risen as well. So we'll have to see some of the more recent information, but I think that's fair to say. On the employee side, I know on the employee rate, we're certainly well above the median, especially for a Social Security state, meaning one where most of our members are in Social Security as well. So well above the median on that, and I think that bodes is true as well for on the employer side. Maybe not as much, but still higher.
So I just want to say thank you. This is, I think, one of the first that I've been in the legislature 12 years time. We've sat down and had really open conversations about PERS, but we had a few this past session we're not aware of. The board make the changes, recommendations they made in December. So I do appreciate you coming forward and have these conversations. But I think you would admit, your board would admit, everybody here understands that this didn't just happen in December of 2022. So my question here is about timing. How long has your board known about this impending crisis?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis. I mean, I could see, and I definitely respect your question and concern. I wouldn't call it a crisis. Again, kind of like I said earlier, what I think is important, though, it's important for us. We're fiduciaries. We have to administer the trust, administer the benefits in law. But part of that also is to relay good information to the sponsor, to the state that's the sponsor of the plan, and the other stakeholders. So I think by doing this and doing it well in advance, I think is actually helpful, because the worst thing and I appreciate your kind words in the beginning there, and I agree, I want to continue this conversation. We want to be available and as a resource and as a partner. But one of the worst things that I think that we could do right now is to not provide good information or the cost on that, because if you don't have good assumptions, then you're inadvertently understating the liabilities and underfunding the plan. And that's part of the reason why we've tried to put that out there now, because right now the rate's 17.4. It's just going to 19.4 in July. If everything continues course, it would just be 2 more percentage points a year after that. But we've gone ahead and explained the possibility of this 27 based on current projections. No, we can't predict the future. We can't hold the future. Nobody can do that, and it could go up or down. But in an effort to be transparent and to provide that and to share the information, so that policymakers such as you yourself and others, can work together and we can have these conversations. As far as the board historically and now, I probably should speak more to my few years here. But we constantly monitor the plan, the actuarial reports, the valuation and projections done each year. We do the experience study every 2 years on a rolling 4-year basis. Do that in very open public forum. Of course, the legislature has the 4 non-voting members dedicated to the PERS board. We work closely with the elbow staff. They're their peer, of course, the committee and staff, good staff there as well, does a report each year on the financial soundness. And so I think it's just, as I mentioned, it's just built up over the last 20 years. But we try to do our stuff regularly and annually and look forward to continuing to be transparent and sharing information.
I appreciate that. Whether it would be a crisis or not, I don't know that you're necessarily hearing from counties and cities and school districts, taxpayers, 4,500 years. So it doesn't matter whether we say a crisis or it's an issue. Again, my question is, how long has the board known this stage? Since your time, since when you first came, or before that, or
Sure. Well, I think everything. I don't want to. I mean, it's kind of hard to answer that because everything changes, everything evolves, and today the number is different than it was last year because we've had a year go by, and we've changed assumptions, and we've had a different investment returns, and the benefits have grown. So, I could say this: the board is always working in the best interest of the system and the membership, and trying to be transparent and good partners with the legislature. That knows about PERS shouldn't necessarily be surprised because PERS is a great system. It's a system that affects so many within the state, and these benefits have been in statute for 20 years, and the benefits and the liabilities have been growing, and all these reports are done in public. So it's hard to answer that because things change, but each year we're available. We report it. We do it. We share it. So there's I apologize if I'm not answering as directly as you like, but it's hard to do because everything changes through each
Let me
year.
ask it a different way. Other than now, within the last few months, immediate time frame, when has the PERS board come forward wholesale recommendation changes?
Well, I know that we've definitely been talking about them in great detail since shortly after I've been here. This is probably the first session, if you think about with the various election cycles and the pandemic and things like that, this will be the first session that we've brought forth or will be bringing forth some proposed changes. But I understand that we brought some before. I think one time before, prior to my joining PERS, I think just as an example, I think there was a proposal maybe to change the COLA to monthly as opposed to lump sum, but it did not move forward legislatively. I know that may be a little different what you're talking about. Of course, there was a new tier proposed in 2011. I think there were some changes in 2007. So there have been changes over the years. And I know prior to 2018, there was a great deal of research and a report, I think, created given some of the challenges and some of the options. So this will be the first time since I've been here that we probably will be coming forward with a legislative package. But I think over the years, PERS has suggested changes and so on and so forth.
Just see if you agree with me. The current status quo is not sustainable. That's what I'm thinking.
I wouldn't necessarily use it. I can see why you asked the question that way. I wouldn't say it's not sustainable, but I will say that it's either something has to cost more or something has to change. And either the rate has to go up or the benefits have to change. That would be my assessment and recommendation.
The current payment structure is not sustainable long-term financial health.
I wouldn't necessarily use the word not sustainable because it depends on how it's funded.
Well, let's use your words, because you said we either fund it or lose it. So I'm using your words.
Sure, yeah. And to say it'd be fund it, change it, or eventually risk it. And to unpack that, it's something's either going to have to cost more, like the rate, or something's going to have to change, like the benefit, or raise the rate, cut the benefit, however you want to say it. I wouldn't say it's not sustainable because if it's funded, then it's sustainable. We all want to work towards sustainability.
I said the current funding model
Yeah.
is not sustainable. Not if we make changes, but as we sit here today, the current structure, we got to do something. That's what I mean.
I would recommend something. And I would recommend some changes and things. And I would also recommend the additional funding, and that could be the something. And that's why I won't necessarily say it's not sustainable, because if it's funded, then it would be sustainable. Now, staying at the 17.4,
that's what I'm asking.
That would not, that would not be, I definitely recommend the rate going up. The rate needs to increase.
And you would agree with me that this, as you said earlier, this did not happen. It happened last September, it happened last 6 months.
No, sir. Overall, it's built up over years, over for a variety of reasons and factors.
Yes, sir. Senator Horn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Higgins, you mentioned monthly distribution versus lump sum. What's the rationale behind going that route?
Sure. Well, to talk more broadly on that, it's mainly because this would be a minor change, because really just be changing the default. But in general, the reason it brought this topic up and the reason we recommend exploring it is to sum it up in 3 ways. I'd say for planning purposes, cash flow purposes, and maybe some tax considerations on behalf of the retiree or the member, because in talking with our outside tax counsel, due to the nature of our COLA, for some members, the size that it could possibly become, it may need to be treated differently for tax reasons. But mainly from the PERS standpoint would be for planning and cash flow. And to give you an example on that, this coming December, the lump sum COLA is estimated to be around $850 million. And when you add to that the regular monthly payroll, which is now over $200 million, you're going to be over $1 billion right there in the same time frame. Because you got December payroll, the lump sum, plus the January payroll. So you're over $1 billion, which if you remember the amount earlier, that's going to be a third of the total payment right there in one lump sum type area. And the 850 is expected to grow about 50 million a year. So you have a large amount of money coming out of the system at the same time, at one time. And that's going to go on, and it's a good benefit, and we understand that, and we've been managing for that, and we're going to continue to do that. But it's a large amount, and we have to prepare for that regardless of what's going on in the world or what's going on in the market. For example, the markets could be down in the fall or in December. Some years it's up, some years it's down. And so the move for that and the consideration of that would be just better for planning purposes as opposed to the one lump sum.
All right. And what is the average lump sum distribution?
It is approximately $7,200 based on the last published actuarial report.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that we've had a downturn in the number of employees who are participating in the program. How many folks are participating in the program, both retirees and current workers right now, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
Sure. The last published report has about 144,000 active members and I believe around 114,000 retirees. Over the last 10 years, going back to the active retiree declining, over the last 10 years, the number of actives, I think, has gone down about 10 or 11%, and the number of retirees has increased by around 26 or 27%. But the last report was 144,000 actives and about 114,000 retirees.
Okay, and so we've lost active members. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And that has certainly had an impact on the healthiness of the fund.
It has.
Okay.
Not the only factor, but certainly a factor.
Okay. All right. And you mentioned in these notes, there's some discussion about consideration of a dedicated funding stream. And do you have suggestions on what that would be?
No, at this time, we probably would refer that to the legislature, but I know sometimes in various states and things there may be dedicated revenue streams. I remember a few years ago, and I may be wrong on this, but about the time I joined here in Mississippi, I think the lottery was passed, and I think a lot of that's dedicated toward roads and bridges. So just that as an example, but really a lot of that is just trying to respond and give options, because I know there was concern about the rate. There was concern from the legislature about the rate and the cost on the locals. So part of that is just trying to explore options and ideas to help alleviate that or do that. It may be that the best way is to still continue to fund it all through the employer rate, but then do some kind of other revenue sharing or rebate or prebate or something with the locals in the cities. And of course, then there's the request for consideration of appropriations associated with the benefits of the past, but don't have a specific suggestion at this time, really just trying to explore alternatives in response to the concerns.
Thank you. And one final question. You're talking about calculating the rate of 7% versus 7.55. What's the rationale?
It's important to have good assumptions. In this particular case, if you don't, then you inadvertently understate the liabilities and you underfund the plan, because the lower the rate, the more the contribution rate. The lower the assumed rate, the more the contribution rate would be. And also, all things being equal, if you're choosing between 7, 7.5, 7 or 7.25, the lower rate, I think, is best for PERS, best for the plan. But you're also setting yourself up, if all things being equal, choosing between that, as long as there's these incremental differences. The lower rate better sets you up for success because it's setting you up for actuarial gains as opposed to actuarial losses. And basically every expert that's looked at this has recommended that rate, the rate going down. And it's also important that we do it because that's our job as fiduciaries. And the law says we're supposed to set the rates and the tables and so forth based on actuarial evaluation. But also it's important to share that information with the state because the statute also says that you are the sponsor and it's an obligation of the state. So we're certainly all on the same team for that. And I think that's the best route.
So how does the 7% rate stack up against other states?
It is on the last graph I saw, which will change a little bit because it changes as each state takes action. And it'll change since we took action a little bit. But I think we're going to be right around the median with the 7% and maybe slightly above the average. Prior to the change, we were the highest or one of the highest in the country. I know in the NASRA database, NASRA is National Association of State Retirement Administrators. It's much like it sounds. And it has data on all the public pensions or most of the public pensions, state pensions nationwide. And we were the only one over 7.5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hobson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ray, I know about 10 years ago, the legislature voted to increase the employee contribution and add the 30-year retirement back in. I think it was that originally, but at that time, my recollection is that there was a projection that within 25 or 30 years, the system would be healthy again. What happened to, once we made those changes, what happened to take the system back to a place where it was kind of unhealthy?
Sure. I'd have to go back and look. Obviously not being here then, I probably would need to, for the details, I would need to maybe look at the reports back then or the projections and so on and so forth. But just generally what I can say is everything that's happened since that time, when you have different assumptions or lowered assumptions, you have positive investment returns, you have negative investment returns, or any time that you miss the assumed rate of return, even if it may be positive, if it's less than what was being assumed, then that could be a challenge. There's also the declining in active retiree ratio that's happened since that time. So it's just really a combination. And also the timing of investment returns, good or bad, really makes a difference. For example, the old illustration of if you have $100 and you lose 50%, well, now you've got $50. And at first glance, you could say, well, I really need to get that 50% back. But actually, you got to get 100% back just to get back to where you started from and going forward. So I'd have to go back and look at those details. But it's a combination of factors. I know that the assumed rate back then was probably 8%. I'm not sure without checking, but it's been lowered to 7.75, then 7.55, and of course now 7. The actives has continued to decline since that time. So it's really just a variety of everything that's happened since then.
Yeah, where do we stack up on employee contribution percentage? I think Representative Lamar asked you about the employer contribution.
Yeah.
Where do we stack up nationally on the employee contribution?
And the employee, and before I forget it, let me say this too about projections. Projections are just that. The actuarial projections, they're based on good information and performed by competent staff and individuals, but none of us can predict the future. It really is. It's just projections based on what we have at the time and so forth. To the employee, I'd say well above average, above the median. I'd almost say the employee side is probably one of the higher ones, especially for a Social Security state, but definitely above the median and average in general and for a Social Security state.
So we're above the median on the employee and employer contribution
Yes.
rates. I think he also mentioned the cities, county. We're hearing from the cities, counties, hospitals, schools, other agencies in the state. The concern is, of course, they won't be able to fund their programs, may have to lay off employees, may have not be able to hire employees. When the board considered these, the employer contribution, was it ever discussed that you could have even further decline in employment and less people that are paying into the system? Was that discussed?
Yes, I think so, and I think that's considered. And certainly the concern and the worry, if you will, toward the cities and counties or that cost is definitely something that was thought about and analyzed. And it's part of what makes it so hard. And it makes it also hard on the board in the decision. So, yeah, the short answer, I'd say all those things are definitely considered. Some things discussed more than others, but certainly. And more broadly on that, we're definitely sympathetic to that point, respect that concern, sympathetic to the employers at the local level. But as you know, as fiduciaries and under our duties in the law, we have to do what's best for the system. And we would be remiss if we didn't provide good information and rates and assumptions and so forth to all of you. But part of the reason we're doing it, and with the phased-in approach and communicating some of these things now, is so the decision makers, policymakers, and local officials have notice, have in advance, and we can all work together and answer questions like this. But it is considered.
Final question is when you consider that, did you think about, did the board ever look at getting scenarios where you would take, let's just say we don't raise the employer contribution that much, or we don't raise it much at all. Did you go through scenarios where you said, what if we raised it 1 or 2%? How is this going to affect the employment for cities and counties? And they're probably on tighter budgets than even, certainly the state's got a bigger budget, but still it affects state agencies too. I'm hearing it from state agency directors saying, I'm concerned about programs. I'm concerned about hiring employees, certainly concerned about anybody that may be able to get a raise, not be able to get a raise. Did you ever factor in, if we don't do an employer contribution increase or we limit that increase, what are some other steps we can take in the system that will help make it actuarially sound?
Yes, basically many items like that have been discussed or analyzed or looked at some point. Maybe not the exact level of detail to break out at the city and county level, like you may have said, but certainly different scenarios of different rates. And I know in last year's report, part of what prompted the actuary to recommend the 22.4% was the analysis and the projections and the funding metrics and so forth. By not raising the rate, did not in any way paint a good picture for PERS, and that's why that was recommended. And we do feel the rate definitely has to increase. We have had a lot of discussion about all aspects of it, including the declining thing. And on that, I would mention to you, one of the things we want to emphasize this session too is consideration of any initiatives, other laws or whatnot that do anything to reduce the number of members in PERS or to incentivize reducing the number of PERS. All of those law changes are initiatives, and we understand and respect the fact they're for a reason, and they're good points. They may be good policy and they're good initiatives. I'm not questioning that at all. But anything that is decreasing the number of folks paying into PERS does have an impact, and we want to make sure we highlight that.
Right, let me stop right there. You do understand what we've heard from mayors and supervisors is raising it 10 points will have that exact effect. They will lay people off that won't be in the system.
Sure.
So y'all voted on a plan that will do exactly that according to these policymakers throughout the state. So there's a disconnect in here somewhere about employees and folks on the plan are off of it because they're not going to raise their local taxes. What they're telling us is they're just going to lay people off.
Yeah.
And reduce services. So
Sure.
that probably needs to enter back into y'all's conversation at some
Well,
point.
we definitely can do that, and we can look at that. Definitely will, and it does have an impact. And we've had the actuary do some preliminary estimates of what the impact could have been. So we can do that. Let me say this though, very respectfully. I see where you're coming from. We've heard that too, and we follow the news occasionally, so I know it's there, and we're sympathetic to that. And that's why I say, and I really want us all to work together. But at PERS, we're the fiduciaries set up in law to administer the trust. We have to do what is in the best interest of the system, and then we also have a duty to you and others and those stakeholders to relay it. And we're trying to do what we can with the phase in, with the recommended Tier 5. We'll look at some analysis, more analysis of what you just talked about. Trying to be transparent and putting it out there now because it gives plenty of time for all the policymakers and decision makers to create solutions, discuss solutions, consider changes, and so forth. The other thing I will say, as it relates to the cities and the counties, is we also have to remember this is the funding for the benefit for their employees. Again, very sympathetic to the cost on the employers and the local level, but part of what we're doing it this way is to be transparent and provide that time for the solutions or the discussion. I think when we looked at it last time, the total amount for the cities and counties with the 5% increase to 22.4 was a little over 60 million. I think each 1% incremental increase was around 12 or 13 million. So I know that's a large number, but maybe not so much in the context of PERS or in the context of state funds, general funds. But it's important to remember, and again, sympathetic to the cost and their concerns they're expressing, and look forward to working with them. We've talked with the municipal league. We look forward to talking with them again. Talked to them before the recent board meeting. So we want to share and be partners, and we'll do that analysis. But it is the benefit for their employees, their police officers, their firefighters, their sanitation workers. And, in other words, that's not exactly the same thing as, some kind of regulation coming down from Washington. The other thing to keep in mind is the cities and counties joined PERS voluntarily by joinder agreement years ago, and much to their chagrin, their proportionate share of the unfunded liability has been on their books for several years now. And so that's not to disagree at all with what you're saying. We'll look at that even more, and it does have an impact, but it's important to remember that,
You would agree that we're going, your recommendation is going from 17.4. You're adding 10 points. That's over a 50% increase. I know you've said we'll do it in 5 years if we were to go along with that, but there's no way they could sit there and plan for a 50% increase. I mean, that may work on your books,
Sure.
And I know the mandate's not coming from Washington. It's coming from your board, which is PERS retirees, right?
I wouldn't say the last part, not Washington. That was just an example because I've heard PERS be referred to in like an unfunded mandate. So as far as the board, not all retirees. We have 2 retirees elected to the board. And so all are elected. There's a 10-person board. They're all elected except 2. The state treasurer is an ex officio member, and then the governor has an appointee that's a member, and then the other ones are elected. 1 from counties, 1 from municipalities, 2 from retirees, 2 from state employees, 1 from the institutions of higher learning, and then 1 public schools and junior colleges.
I misspoke. They're most all state employees, not necessarily retirees, right?
That's true. That's right.
I misspoke.
But as far as it's not necessarily coming from the board, other than the board. I mean, obviously, we made those decisions. We have to because that's
It's coming directly from the board.
Well, it is, but we're just carrying out our duties as fiduciaries as outlined in state statute. I mean, so you're right. It's definitely coming from us, but only because we're trying to fulfill our role.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've got a question, because I've heard you say it more times on account about your fiduciary duty, you got a job to do and all that, and I 100%, we all agree with you. The board does. Have those duties. But I also heard you say a few minutes ago that you got, I think your exact quote was, every expert we've talked to recommended this in rate of 7%. Up until just recently, as long as I can tell, this in rate of 7%. Yeah, these duties, we'll make sure we follow our duties. Why did it take so long to bring down the consumer rate return from 8 to 7?
Well, I think the recommendations I'm talking about are recent, basically the last two experience studies.
You're telling this committee that has not been recommended to your board for years and years and years to bring the highest consumer rate recommendation down to something more line?
I wouldn't say years and years and years. It was recommended in the experience study before last, and we changed the funding policy to transition down to that recommendation, which we did do by 20 basis points from at that time 7.75 to 7.55. And then the most recent one was completed in April, and that's where that comes in. So it's everything. We do it all the time. We do it each year. PEER does their report each year. But the ones I'm referring to are relatively recent. Now, has that been recommended for a short amount of time? Yes, as I just explained. But I'm referring to more recent recommendations.
I've got another question about COLA, and I just help my simple mind understand this. The recommendation is to not have a default that does the COLA once a year, but rather goes down monthly. Is that right?
That's correct. The default will be monthly.
Cash flow reasons.
Plan, yeah.
Help me understand why it wouldn't, if it's for cash flow reasons, why would you not take out? I'm not a banker, but I'm thinking the person who holds money, there's a reason banks want to hold money. All right, so why would we not take out that 1/12 COLA every month, set it in another account, we hold on to it longer, and it gains some interest, while we hold it instantly once a year?
Well, the main thing, again, just for planning purposes, and so we can better do that. But I think what we may be talking about that I think is a little sometimes misunderstood out in the public because it's in December. The COLA is actually based on fiscal year. When I hear December originally, you think end of the year, as in what I think you're getting at. We get to hold on to the money for the year and then send it out. But the actual COLA payment is calculated based on fiscal year. So it really just depends on who's living, who's dying, and so on and so forth, what's going on in the markets and all. So our reason for trying to go monthly would be just to level that out as opposed to the one big payment.
I understand that. You can hold on to the money longer if you keep the PERS system correct instead of paying it out.
True. That in and of itself.
You hold on to the money longer, and separate as a money market, so
Well, actually, if I understand you correctly,
what I'm saying?
sure, if I understand you correctly, we actually took a move this past year to do something like that. We started within our fixed income asset structure to develop a short duration sleeve to do exactly that, to pull money and put over there to prepare for that COLA. So if I understand you right, we actually just did something very much like you're describing.
I'm hearing you say now, you're not going to stick with it.
Oh, we're going to stick with it, but I would prefer, it was just the recommendation is going to be to shift the default to monthly, but it's for the reasons that we talked about. One thing, if I could go back just a little bit, I forget exactly where it was. It might have been with Speaker Pro Tem White and the others about the 27% and about the 10% and about the increase and all that. Again, very sympathetic to that cost. And I know this is tough. I know it's hard. I know it's hard for them, y'all, certainly you, all the competing challenges that you have at the state level, whether it be this, schools, infrastructure, whatever. Definitely respect that. But one thing we have to all realize, and it's part of the reason that I've shared it with the board and now coming forward more, is the longer we wait, the harder it gets and the more it costs and the tougher it is, which is why I'm trying to do it now, but very sympathetic to that point.
Senator Harkins. Thank you. What specifically were the changes made in 98, 99 when they changed the benefit, changing the benefit plan for PERS? What were the specific changes that were made?
Sure. I actually would probably need to go back and look at the document for all the specifics, but to give a real good general feel, it's the current cost of living benefit structure. The current benefits in law was during that time frame. And then also they increased the benefit multiplier, and I don't remember exactly what the incremental change was, but by benefit multiplier, that's the amount of credit you get each year. Right now it's the 2% each year. So whatever it was back then during that time frame, they increased the multiplier, the state increased the multiplier and did it for current and future retirees at the time, which essentially means made it retroactive. So two main points. There might have been some other minor changes and smaller changes, but two main ones that come to mind is the existing cost of living structure and increasing the benefit multiplier for everyone at the time.
Can you get a very detailed description of what exactly was changed when we did that?
Sure.
Secondly, I see you have some recommendations for a new Tier 5, and it still has a defined benefit plan. Why are we not going to a defined contribution plan? And does a defined contribution plan eliminate a lot of the issues that we're faced with right now?
It would not, ironically.
It would not?
No, sir. And let me share a little bit on that and talk a little bit more on that. If you go to and we definitely wouldn't recommend moving to a defined contribution plan, but a lot of the reasons that a lot of states have not done that is, even though to me it seems a little counterintuitive, if you close PERS, which is what would happen if you go to a DC, it actually costs you more because you still have the $20 billion unfunded to pay, and then you have whatever you decide that the DC contribution plan would be for those employees. And then over time, because it's a closed plan, you have additional concerns and costs that may develop because you won't have people paying in. And due to that, you may have to start to change your asset allocation, which will indirectly cost more. So that does change long-term future liabilities. But even though it may seem counterintuitive, closing a plan going to a full DC actually can cost you more. And I think that's why a lot of states may look at it at first blush, but then they change not to do it. I remember years ago in Georgia, where I'm from, when there was a change in administration, that was kind of the thought. There was the DC, but then once it was evaluated, there was the change because realizing that cost. Now, some states have employed a hybrid where you have DB and DC together, but going to a full DC usually costs more because you don't do anything about the $20 billion, and you still have that, and then you have to pay for whatever the new plan is as well.
Well, in our previous meetings over the last 3-4 years, you've given me a kind of not a stat or just some information that says by 2045 we should be 90% or 85 or 90% funded. What happened to that? Well, and that was before you are raising the employer contribution. This was at the 17.4. We'll be, basically saying we'll be fine in the outlying years because the cost is not going to be as high.
Sure. Good point. It varies each year. It changes each year. And in fact, going back to that, and I think you're probably remembering session before last, after the record investment year. And I'll say this half jokingly, I almost want to stop providing some of those projections. I feel like I need to because I want to give an honest and accurate update when you all ask, and that's part of our policy and that's part of the metrics, and we have to do it. But they are just projections at the time based on the assumptions at the time or what's going on at the time, and they can change. And that's what's happened in this case. Those are just each year, and things change based on investment returns, actuarial experience, whatever the case may be. Going back to that time frame, that projection is pretty sensitive to investment returns, and I think the difference is coming off of the negative investment year. It was up with the great record year, then it was down with the negative year, and now we're at 7.76, and the actuary's working on this year. That's a long way of saying it changes, but I see where you're coming from.
I would rather not hear it because it really doesn't hold any value because it doesn't mean anything. I mean, we're seeing it right now. I mean, that was the last 2 or 3 times we had met. It was, in the 2040 time frame, we're going to be at a much better funding ratio. Well, you can't say that if you don't have something that, I mean, if you can't back it up, then I'd rather not hear it. I'd rather just go on what we got and deal with it. But it gives a false sense of security to us to sit there and say, well, things are going to be fine. If we just stay the same, things are going to eventually work out based on historical trends, records that we've had over the past 10, 15, 20 year returns. Things will be 85, 90% funded by 2045 when that's obviously not the case. And I would personally rather not hear it than, and just deal with what we've got to deal with.
Well, appreciate that. We'll definitely keep that in mind. And in some ways, we're kind of doing that now already, but definitely appreciate that feedback.
Representative Bowden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ray, I've got one question, but it probably requires two answers. In our handout right here that it's saying the board approves seeking direct appropriation cash infusion from the legislature for this next fiscal year. My questions, two questions of that. How much is the board recommending and what would that money be used for?
Well, it's still to be determined because that just came out of the last meeting and the discussion of a variety of other things too. But we certainly want to be partners with the legislature and see what availability might be there. To give an example of what the cash infusion or the appropriations or direct appropriations could be referring to or maybe would be associated with the benefits I mentioned from the late 90s and early 2000s. When we've looked at that with the actuary, it's been estimated around 22%, over 20% of the current unfunded liability is based on those benefits. And brought forward to today, they have estimated that's around $4.2 billion. And to say another way, it would be about 5% of payroll. And if you took that amount and you amortized it or spread it out over 25 or 30 years, depending on what interest rate you did and what year, it'd be about $350 million a year. So I could see the request being refined to something like that, around $350 million a year for those benefits. But it really, as much as anything, it was to provide options.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes. First of all, let me just say how much I've enjoyed working with you, Ray. You've been a breath of fresh air over there. Every time I've talked to you, you're very responsive, and I know you're just the messenger here today. So sorry for you having to fill all these questions. To Representative Lamar's point, your predecessor sat in this very meeting. How long you been here, by the way?
About 5 years, a little more.
So 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And I asked her, she came and represented to us that everything was hunky-dory at PERS. And I said, well, does that mean you'll never ask for any more money from the legislature? She said, no, I can't make that guarantee. So in response to his question, I would say as many years ago as 6 years ago, there was a belief or a statement by her that there was the potential to have to come back. And we have believed for a long time before that. So it's been quite a while, is my point, that there has been this belief that there was a problem over there that needed to be addressed. I'm going to ask what I try to boil this down as simply as I can. The request of your board is to raise this rate from 17.4 to 22 or 23, correct?
That's
5%.
Right. It's 22.4 as it stands right now, phased in.
Go up 5%. We are hearing from the cities all over the state. The Hattiesburg tells me it's going to cost them $2 million. My town of Clinton, I think, if I'm right, don't hold me to this, I think they said $1 million. I know we got two members of this committee sitting right in front of you who represent Hattiesburg right now. The only two options for those cities to come up with that money. One is to do what Representative White said, and that is cut services, $2 million worth of services. The other is to raise the millage, which is, if I'm right, that's the only mechanism they have to come up with more money. Is that right, Senator Harkins? Which is a tax increase on the taxpayers and the citizens. It all falls back on the citizens. We're either going to provide them with less services that they're paying for, or we're going to raise their millage rates. Those are the only two options that these cities have. Does your board understand that they're basically calling for a tax increase on the citizen?
Well, thank you for your kind words. And
do they understand it? Do they understand that what they have proposed will either result, and I stand to be corrected, I don't oversimplify it, but there ain't but two options: cut services or raise millage. And your board is comfortable asking for one of those two measures to be done.
I would say that's not really our role. Our job is just to administer this into law, and which is to.
You tell me they don't care?
Oh no, we care. In fact, I would almost say they may care too much.
But it's not their role. That implies they don't care.
No, they definitely care. Definitely considered it. I think that's why this topic has been so very hard in determining which ones to recommend thus far.
So they've considered it, and they're comfortable with making that request.
They're definitely comfortable with fulfilling our fiduciary duty as outlined in law that we have to. And I understand that it's tough, and I respect the concern from you and the others, but we all have to fill our role. We have to do our part as fiduciaries. The city leadership has to administer their cities and budget, and you all in the legislature have a tough job.
Yeah, and we have a responsibility to the taxpayers who sent us here, I believe, to look out for their best interest and look out for what happens to their tax dollars as well. So we have a fiduciary duty as well. But I wanted to make sure that your board understood that what they're calling for results in one of those two actions being taken.
Yeah, we're definitely aware of the cost on employers and would like to avoid it, but we just, that wouldn't be, it would PERS, it's either raise the cost or change the benefit. And of course, the legislature could have some options. You all design the benefits in law. We're certainly willing to work with you and respect the part. And I enjoy working with you and the others as well. What you've highlighted to me is what I see developing is a little bit of a natural tension or friction that can happen between the sponsor and the fiduciary, in other words, the state and the plan, because you're right, you all do have to look out for taxpayer benefit or cost. Of course, we've got to keep in mind this is for the benefit for those services that are provided to those taxpayers. And of course, PERS members and retirees are also taxpayers, various teachers and so forth. But I understand that, but that's why this is so tough. But in our role, our legal and ethical duty has to go toward the membership, much like part of yours is for the taxpayer. And I just hope we work together with options.
Yes, Representative.
I know we've been going for a while, but you've been testifying for a while. I heard your full report. Lots of questions. Nowhere in any of your remarks today have I heard you mention increase employee contribution. Wow.
Couple reasons. One, it is one of the highest in the country, especially for a Social Security state, as we've talked about. But the other reason is
So is the employer. So that can't be your sole.
true, not the sole reason. The other reason is, I'm sorry.
It can't be a reason, or else that wouldn't come back on the employer side.
Well, it's one reason because it leads to this. Right now, the new employees, the current employees, the employees, the active members, and new one hired tomorrow, is paying the great majority of their own retirement benefit as it is now. The rates are made up of normal cost and the accrued liability. As far as a normal cost, think of that as the annual cost of the benefits each year as they're accrued. And right now, and this is reflected in our actuarial reports each year, the employee hired today is paying the majority of their normal cost for the retirement. So that's an additional aspect. But the main reason to what you're talking about is the statutes say that the board shall set the rates, but there's a lot of legal advice, legal analysis, and AG opinions and so forth that say you can't raise the employee rate without an offsetting or corresponding change in the benefit. And that's the benefit that you all control. We can't do that. So, I'm sorry.
What law are you?
It's 2511. I'm not sure the rest. We could definitely get that for you.
State law.
That's right, state law.
They base those opinions on state law.
That's correct.
You realize who-
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. You all could change as far as the
I haven't heard you recommend that. If
True.
we can change it and you can increase the employee contribution. Why are you not bringing that as a potential part of the solution?
Well, we can definitely go back and look at that, but I will say they're already paying the great majority of their retirement benefit. We're already one of the highest in the country, more so.
How are they paying the majority? To me, 9 versus 17.4 going to 22.4, potentially 27. 9 is not the majority.
Because it goes back to that part about the majority of the employer rate goes to pay the unfunded. In other words, what's happened in the past, kind of water under the bridge, it's already accumulated. More specifically, what I'm talking about, when the actuary each year calculates the normal cost, which is like the cost for the benefits on an annual basis, expressed as a percentage of payroll, and it's in our actuary reports. And I believe the last published amount is going to be about 10.6. That's a shared cost between the member and employer. So when you back out the 9% of that 10.6, if my memory is correct on that, that's a large percentage of what that normal cost is. The 17 you're talking about, the great majority of that's going toward the unfunded.
Well, I can't speak for the committee. I'm specifically asking a number of recommendations on how we can also the employee contribution can be part of the solution.
Sure, we can definitely look at that. Sure will.
Other questions? Senator Felgate.
Thank you, Governor. Question, will employees in the optional retirement plan program have the option to move into the PERS, considering any rules changes that y'all are proposing currently?
Yeah, we're not changing anything associated with that. The way it works now is they have a basically a one-time irrevocable choice between ORP or PERS, and what we're proposing wouldn't change that. This just has to do with the amount of the match if they choose ORP.
So that's not a consideration currently.
No, sir.
And on actuarials, how old are you? Or is your actuary saying that the current state retiree will live until?
I want to say it depends by the type of retiree or whatnot. I want to say around 77 might be an expected age range. We can get you that information. There's different tables in there. It depends on the type. Where the teachers live longer, females typically live longer. It just depends on which one.
I was curious because when you just Google the average lifespan in Mississippi, and we're the lowest in the country. Hawaii, I think, is the highest, around 80. We're in Mississippi, and average lifespan is 71.9 currently. So I was curious if state employees just live vastly longer than the average Mississippian does, or where are you getting that information from?
Well, the actuaries do an extensive evaluation, and we can definitely provide that to you. And where it shows up most is in the experience study, the one we just completed, and we keep those on our website, and we'll provide that to you. But they do a good in-depth analysis of our experience as well as the various mortality tables, and we update that from time to time. A couple years ago, we updated to generational mortality. But to your point, and even though I can't quote it chapter and verse, I know that the actuaries over time we've had to adjust it. The tables are the ones we're using due to the different life expectations in Mississippi. But one thing about the PERS membership, if I remember correctly, teachers they're a little healthier, are projected to live longer. And of course, that's over public schools are over 40% of our membership. So that may be why our estimates are a little higher than, say, the Google overall population.
Maybe the 13th check causes people to live longer. Is that
Definitely a good benefit, and access to quality health care has a lot to do with that.
Yes, sir.
Right, going back in your board's deliberations, and I know those are public and folks were there and their minutes and all that. When y'all were considering potential recommendations, and obviously you've already talked about we've only got 2 or 3 levers, something either increases or changes. Did the board consider changing benefits for current retirees or folks that are currently employed with the state?
We've definitely analyzed that a great deal, and we'll do more so. We didn't discuss that, if I remember correctly, too much at the last meeting, but we have looked at that, analyzed that, looked at different scenarios, provided different estimates and so forth over the last months and years. I do anticipate that we'll be talking about that more at the upcoming meeting. I don't know that, and to be clear, just as everybody's aware, regardless of any of my recommendations or any legislative package that the board approves, any changes to any existing benefits, of course, would require legislative action. And the board has certainly not made any recommendations on this topic. But with that said, we have looked at it. I expect we're looking at creating different analyses now. I suspect we'll talk about it more in the October meeting, and happy to provide any of that information or commentary, now or afterwards.
But y'all did look at for new hires. I see potentially a no guaranteed cost of living adjustment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
To me, that would indicate that somebody looking at the system has said, this is where we're getting out of line, is in this particular benefit. Senator Harkins asked you for the changes from 98. In your opening comments, you alluded to all these changes without increased contributions. So it sounded to me like we knew where we're getting out of whack, but when he asked you specifically, you said you really didn't know. It was a combination of things. You go back and look, you're going to get him a detailed list. Isn't that one of the main factors? To me, it's an acknowledgement by your board if you're looking at new hires and saying we're considering no guaranteed cost of living adjustment. Instead, we'll do some permissive language to grant potential COLAs on a consumer price index. So somebody did some analysis somewhere and said this is potentially where we're getting out of line in our current. I'm asking you the question.
Oh, sure, definitely. The COLA has been analyzed, over the years and recently. As far as for the new tier, is a little different because those individuals are not hired yet, and it doesn't come with it. It doesn't bring with it the same potential legal or political challenges that come with. But
we're just trying to identify. Y'all's solutions seem to be just raise the amount of money, and you really don't care where it comes from. Or your answer to the speaker is that's not our job.
Yeah.
But unfortunately for us, that is our job, to figure out where the money comes from. And it's not always just more money for us. as taxpayers had finally said last spring, enough is enough. And that's what led y'all to hold off on your, that wasn't a phase-in. I think it was just a 5-point straight up increase that would have happened by now. It's what your board originally voted on, correct?
That's right.
And I do appreciate your willingness to work with us, but we should acknowledge that's only the result of a potential bill coming that was going to change it, you know, that led us to where we are today. So I hope as we move forward, your board will analyze all aspects of the system and help us come up with a comprehensive, because I think there's been a commitment, at least, you know, around the coffee pot of the lawmakers saying we want to fix this long term, and we want your board to be part of the solution and not just, hey, the answer is just raise the employer contribution. That can't be the answer. So I'm just telling you, I think we've all kind of decided that's not going to be the answer in and of itself. And so with that, you know, when you go back and say, what are those folks saying over there? For my part, and again, I'm like Mr. Lamar said, I don't speak for this group here, but for myself, I would say it's not going to be, we're not just going to increase it 5 to 10 points and hope we get better. Maybe that's a better way for me to say it is, and if y'all are unwilling to make some tough decisions and we have to make them, then maybe we'll just make them all is the point that I want to make is we're not going to, if we want to hold hands, let's hold hands and fix it. It's not, we'll hold hands on the good stuff and we'll let y'all do the bad stuff. I think I want to convey that for what that's worth as we move forward into the legislative session.
Well, I appreciate that feedback, and we'll take that in, we'll relay that, and we'll have good discussion in October. And I know that we'll definitely be providing analysis, options, and commentary. So we'll definitely take that, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Senator Kirby.
You know, I've heard it several times that if we continue to pay the 13th check, just not the 3% increase. In other words, whatever they got last year, they'll get next year. If we did that for 3 years, it would solve all of our problems. Is that true?
I wouldn't use the phrase solve all the problems, but it definitely has a major impact. The other thing is, as time goes by, and of course, I've been here a little over 5 years now, so as time goes by and things change and assumptions change, the details of the numbers may be a little different. But with that said, you have heard that. What I think you're referring to is one of the options that's been analyzed about doing a temporary pause in the COLA growth, prospective growth, for 3 years or 3 to 5 years. And something like that does have a major impact on the projected unfunded liability. And going back to the other comment, that's an example of the either raise the rate or cut the benefits. And the only way you can do anything anytime more immediate or soon is something to existing benefits, which usually gets us to a discussion about the COLA. And you just recalled one of the examples. But things like that, whether it's, and again, this is not a recommendation, it's just a response to the question and the comments. But things like temporarily pausing the COLA growth for 3 to 5 years, or changing the future growth to 2% instead of 3%, or changing the future growth to simple instead of compounded, or temporarily reducing the growth to 1% instead of 3% for several years. Things like that do have the larger impact. And you just recalled one of those examples. That's right.
Thank you. Other questions? By raising it to 22.4 and eventually to 27, am I understanding you correctly?
But yes, sir. The 27 is a possibility. Of course, that's based on projections now.
So if you do 27 and our employee contribution stays the same, it's 9. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that would be 36.4.
That's correct.
And then what is our contribution to Social Security? In addition to, as you mentioned, we're covered by Social Security.
7.65, I believe. That probably includes a little bit with the Medicare, but
so 36.4 plus how much?
7.65, I think.
Okay, so that puts us at 44% for retirement. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then in the private sector, it's about less than 10. So when we're considering this, we may be phasing ourselves out of the market. I mean, we can't pay. We're not going to be able to pay employees. I want everybody to realize that when we talk about the fact that our active employees are 144, where we did a redo of all of our compensation, we're still paid less than the public sector. So by going to 44% overhead for just retirement, not counting the insurance coverage has gone up in the others. It puts us where we can't compete. So it's gonna what ends up happening is exactly the thing that you don't want to have happen either. Is we don't have employees because we can't pay them anywhere near what they can make in the private sector because we're starting off 44% overhead when outside they've got a 401k, they get a 6% match or something. So, I mean, the numbers don't work. So I think it ends up making us just exactly what we're really fearing here is that we end up not having as many active employees to fund the benefits. So and when you go into your considerations, I hope you'll consider the totality of the overhead.
Sure. No, I definitely appreciate that and understand that concern. And you're right on the challenges of paying. One thing I will say, part of the reason of the recommendation for the Tier 5 as it is the hope that the employee contribution could be slightly less, since they have a slightly different benefit. Of course, we're going to look at the option that involves raising it and definitely respect your comments. But you're right in that concern as far as attracting and retaining talent, and we have that challenge as well.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about that. Representative Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Has the system researched the probability of pausing the COLA?
Pausing the COLA? We have analyzed that and looked at it. That's one of the things I was talking about earlier, that one of the options we've done is something about pausing the COLA growth for 3 to 4 or 5 years and the impact that would have on the projected unfunded liability. And that is one of the options that does have an impact.
Okay. Have you come to any conclusions as to whether that would be legally permissible?
There's definitely a lot of legal guidance and analysis out there that you, due to the contract clause, that you should not change the benefit to existing employees or retirees. So there's definitely legal considerations associated with those options.
And what is the prevailing law on that as to whether or not that can be done?
That, I would say, we probably need to consult with the attorneys on that, but to provide a little bit of context on that, I think historically the legal comment, generally speaking, would be no, that you can't make changes, or the California rule. And through a previous decision here in Mississippi, I think the court may have informally, without calling it that, adopted the California rule. But a lot of time has gone by since then. A lot of things have changed. I know other states, even though I don't know the details, but I know several other states have made changes to current benefits. So I know the landscape may have changed, but I guess the prevailing and the historical comment would be that you can't make those changes. That does remind me of one thing I do want to say. Anytime that we've talked about anything, or analyzed, I should say, the COLA or anything, it's always been in the context of only if needed to maintain the fiscal integrity of the plan. I just want to mention that, but I hope that's responsive to your question.
Thank you, sir. Take me back to, and if you would do this, just explain unfunded liability in layman's terms.
It's the difference between what you have and what you need. It's basically the gap. If you close PERS tomorrow, which of course is not realistic, then that would be the amount that you'd be short.
Okay. And in addressing unfunded liability, and I've been hearing about this for many, many years since I've been a member of the legislature, how much time does the system have to address this problem?
It depends on that. There's not really a short answer to that. It depends on so many factors. I do know the amortization period of that unfunded changes each year now in our actuarial report. Right now, that funding period, I think, is around 48 years. But it changes each year.
Thank you, sir.
Other questions? All right. Seeing none, we appreciate you coming today. This is the first full discussion I've really heard of this and the issues that the state's facing. And as you say, we're going hand in hand. I guess all of us are facing. And we appreciate your candor in bringing those numbers to us. One thing I didn't see you address was the peer committee report on your agency or on the retirement plan. Since we've gone over, and I don't know that all the members have those, I wouldn't ask you to go into that at this point, but I would appreciate if you would address it in writing to the committee.
Sure.
There were several different, I think we were red flags on just about everything.
Sure.
So if you could address those to the committee in writing, we would appreciate that, and we'll make that available to the public. I think it came out about a month or so ago.
Sure.
All right. Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.